China's desert revolution, the machines turning sand into forests. When you think of China, images of sandstorms sweeping through cities might come to mind. For decades, this was the reality. But something remarkable has happened over the past 2 decades. Something that has transformed the landscape in ways that seemed impossible just a generation ago. China has added green coverage equivalent to 1/4 of the entire Amazon rainforest. Let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about millions of acres of once barren desert now teeming with vegetation, creating new ecosystems where nothing grew before. The secret behind this extraordinary transformation? A fleet of autonomous machines that locals have started calling sand-eating monsters. Massive technological marvels deployed across the northwestern deserts, equipped with artificial intelligence, precision planting systems, and soil rehabilitation capabilities that sound more like science fiction than agricultural equipment. These aren't your grandfather's tractors. These machines can accomplish in a single day what would take manual laborers weeks to complete. We're talking about coverage of 260 acres, more than 50 times faster than traditional human-led efforts. When videos of these machines began circulating on social media platforms worldwide, engineers from the United States to Europe found themselves both astonished and inspired. Why does this matter to the United States specifically? Because America knows the devastating cost of desertification all too well. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s remains seared into the nation's collective memory as one of the worst ecological catastrophes in its history. Today, states like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona continue battling encroaching deserts, spending billions on land management with mixed results. What China has achieved isn't just a domestic success story. It represents a potential blueprint for desert reclamation worldwide. The technology, the methodology, and the sheer scale of execution offer fresh perspectives for countries grappling with similar environmental challenges. So today, we're going deep into this story. How did China mobilize this technological army against the desert? What makes these machines so revolutionary? And what does this mean for the future of environmental restoration on a global scale? Stay with us as we unpack one of the most ambitious ecological engineering projects of the 21st century. If you're interested in stories about technology, environment, and global innovation, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. The desert that swallowed China. To understand the magnitude of what's happening now, we need to rewind the clock to the turn of the millennium. At the dawn of the 21st century, China confronted an environmental crisis of staggering proportions. Desertification wasn't just an abstract concern discussed in government meetings. It was an existential threat advancing at an alarming pace across the nation's interior. The numbers tell a sobering story. Official surveys revealed that desertified land sprawled across 2.6 million square kilometers. That's roughly 27% of China's entire territory. To put this in perspective, that's an area larger than the entire country of Algeria, the 10th largest nation on Earth. But it gets worse. An additional 1.72 million square kilometers had degraded into sandy wasteland, accounting for about 18% of the nation's landmass. Combined, nearly half of China's land was either already desert or rapidly becoming uninhabitable. Too dry for agriculture, too harsh for human settlement. This wasn't some distant problem affecting only remote regions. The capital itself, Beijing, a metropolis of over 20 million people, found itself on the front line of this ecological battle. Imagine living in a major world capital where, on average, massive sandstorms roll through twice every month. The sky would turn an eerie orange-brown, visibility would plummet, fine particles would infiltrate homes, offices, and schools, respiratory illnesses would spike, daily life would grind to a halt. That was Beijing's reality. Residents learned to check sand and dust forecasts the way others check rain predictions. Parents kept their children indoors during the worst storms. The economic costs, from lost productivity to healthcare expenses, mounted into the billions annually. The deserts were advancing, and they weren't slowing down. Like a slow-motion catastrophe, valuable agricultural land was disappearing under waves of sand. Communities that had farmed the same land for generations were forced to abandon their homes. The environmental refugees from desertification numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Chinese government recognized that this wasn't just an environmental issue. It was a matter of national security, economic stability, and social cohesion. Something had to be done, and it had to be done on an unprecedented scale. The first solution, when humans fought the desert by hand. As the new century began, China launched what would become one of the largest environmental restoration campaigns in human history. Billions of dollars were allocated. Thousands of workers were mobilized. Scientists, engineers, and agricultural experts were brought together to tackle the seemingly impossible task of pushing back the desert. One of the early breakthroughs came in the Tengger Desert, one of China's largest sandy expanses covering over 42,000 square kilometers in the northwestern region. Here, researchers developed and refined a technique that would prove remarkably effective: the straw checkerboard method. The concept is elegantly simple, though brutally difficult to execute. Workers take drought-resistant plant materials, wheat straw, rice stalks, reeds, and push them vertically into the sand in a grid pattern, creating small squares roughly 1 meter on each side. These squares form a kind of living fence that serves multiple purposes. First, they act as windbreaks. When wind-driven sand hits these barriers, it loses momentum and deposits its load rather than continuing to blow and erode the land. Second, the straw gradually decomposes, adding organic matter to the sterile sand and improving its ability to retain moisture. Third, these protected squares create microenvironments where other plants can take root and establish themselves. The results, achieved through decades of patient effort, were genuinely impressive. More than 6 million mu, that's approximately 1 million acres, of the Tengger Desert saw significant improvement. About 10% of the targeted area successfully transitioned from lifeless sand dunes to functioning oasis ecosystems with sustained vegetation. Local communities that had watched the desert advance for generations suddenly saw it retreat. Plants took hold. Small animals returned. The land that had seemed irreversibly dead began showing signs of recovery. But there was a catch, a big one. This method required an enormous amount of human labor. Teams of workers had to physically venture into the hostile desert environment, often in extreme heat, carrying bundles of straw. They would kneel in the sand, sometimes for hours, pushing straw pieces into the ground one by one, creating these protective grids square by square, acre by acre. It was backbreaking work. Progress was measured in meters per day, not hectares. The logistics of supporting large teams in remote desert regions, providing water, food, shelter, and medical care, added layers of complexity and cost. When researchers calculated the timeline for complete restoration based on current methods, the results were discouraging. At the existing pace, fully converting the Tengger Desert alone into stable, vegetated land would take approximately a century. That's 4 generations of sustained effort before the job would be complete. And the Tengger was just one of China's major deserts. The country faced similar challenges in the Gobi, the Badiane-Jaran, the Ulanbu, and numerous other sandy regions. Using purely manual methods across all these areas wasn't just impractical, it was essentially impossible. The Chinese government and scientific community realized they needed a paradigm shift. Manual labor had proven the concept worked, but scaling up required something radically different. They needed to mechanize desert restoration without losing the effectiveness of the proven techniques. The race was on to develop technology that could match human precision and care while operating at machine speed and scale. Enter the giants, the Jumang 301 revolution. In February 2024, Chinese researchers unveiled something that would fundamentally change the desert reclamation game. They called it the Jumang 301, named after the ancient Chinese deity of vegetation and springtime, and it represented a quantum leap in environmental engineering. This wasn't a simple tractor with a planting attachment. The Jumang 301 is a sophisticated robotic system that integrates multiple desert restoration functions into a single autonomous platform. Think of it as a mobile ecosystem restoration factory on tracks. Here's how it works and why it's revolutionary. The machine comes equipped with large onboard storage compartments that hold thousands of straw pieces, the same rice stalks and wheat straw that manual workers had been using for decades. But instead of humans pushing these into the sand by hand, the Jumang 301 uses hydraulic press mechanisms that can drive the straw deep into the ground with consistent pressure and perfect spacing. The system's computer vision and GPS navigation allow it to create the classic checkerboard pattern with mathematical precision across uneven desert terrain. The grid squares it produces are uniform in size and perfectly aligned, optimizing their wind-blocking effectiveness. But the Jumang doesn't stop at straw placement. Simultaneously, as it lays down the organic grid, it deploys specialized sand-fixing agents, chemical compounds that bind loose particles together, creating a more stable substrate. These agents are sprayed with calibrated precision, ensuring even coverage without waste. The synchronization is the key. What used to be multiple separate operations, laying straw, applying fixatives, preparing soil, now happens in one continuous pass. The efficiency gains are extraordinary. By April 2024, just 2 months after the Jumang 301's debut, more than 130 different types of desert control machinery had been deployed to the Kubuki Desert in Inner Mongolia, creating what was essentially an outdoor laboratory for mechanized ecosystem restoration. The Kubuki became a proving ground where over 30 different types of specialized equipment demonstrated their capabilities. Some focused on sand stabilization, others specialized in vegetation planting. Still others handled soil analysis and monitoring. These machines weren't operating blindly. They incorporated advanced sensor arrays that could sample soil composition, measure moisture levels, and assess sand stability in real time. All this data fed into centralized big data platforms that provided instant analysis and recommendations. This meant operations could be dynamically adjusted on the fly. If sensors detected that a particular area needed extra soil amendments, the system could automatically deploy additional resources to that location. If moisture readings suggested certain plants would thrive in specific zones, planting machines could adjust their seed selection accordingly. It was adaptive, responsive desert management at a scale never before attempted. The Tengur test. Proof of concept. To truly demonstrate what this new generation of machinery could accomplish, Chinese authorities selected an 8,000-acre section of the Tengur Desert as a comprehensive demonstration zone. This would be the ultimate stress test. The deployment was massive. 100 sand-fixing machines, 50 automated seedling planters, dozens of tracked transport vehicles, multiple sand barrier installation units, all working in coordinated formation like a mechanical army with a single mission: turn sand into soil. The Jumang 301 robots became the stars of the operation, and their performance exceeded even optimistic projections. In a single day, one 24-hour period, this fleet of machines completed straw checkerboard installation across 260 acres. To appreciate what this means, consider that skilled manual teams might cover 4 to 5 acres per day with intensive effort. The machines were operating at over 50 times human speed. But speed without quality would be meaningless. The real question was whether mechanized planting could match the survival rates achieved through careful human attention. The answer turned out to be yes, and then some. Take the planting of salix, a genus of willow plants particularly well suited to desert conditions. These hardy shrubs can survive in arid environments and help stabilize sand with their root systems. Manual planting teams could typically plant about 150 to 160 salix specimens per acre in a full day's work. The Jumang 301 could plant 159 salix plants per acre in just 20 minutes. The implications are staggering. What previously required entire teams working for weeks could now be accomplished by a small number of machines in days. The bottleneck in desert restoration, the sheer labor requirements, had been shattered. But the Jumang 301's capabilities extended beyond simple planting. The machine could simultaneously create multiple types of sand barriers. It could lay horizontal sand nets that create a protective surface layer while also installing vertical seedling barriers that block wind and create sheltered zones for young plants. The horizontal net laying operation could cover 100 to 200 acres per day, creating a stabilizing blanket over loose sand. The vertical barrier installation, which provides more intensive protection for valuable seedlings, could still manage 150 to 200 acres daily. Perhaps most impressively, the machines addressed one of the fundamental problems that had plagued manual desert planting depth. When human workers tried to dig holes in loose desert sand with shovels, the sand would constantly collapse back into the hole. It was nearly impossible to dig deep enough to reach moisture-retaining layers below the surface. Seedlings planted in shallow holes had to rely on surface water, which evaporated quickly under the intense desert sun. Survival rates suffered accordingly. The Jumang 301's hydraulic planting system, however, could punch through the loose surface sand and place seedlings at optimal depths, deep enough to access subsurface moisture but not so deep as to inhibit growth. Sensors monitored soil composition in real time, allowing the system to adjust planting depth dynamically based on local conditions. The result? Significantly higher survival rates for planted vegetation. The machines weren't just faster than humans, they were more effective. Local workers who had spent years doing this backbreaking labor manually couldn't believe what they were seeing. One longtime desert restoration worker described the experience as watching the future arrive. Tasks that had taken his team weeks now unfolded in hours before his eyes. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. For communities that had fought a losing battle against the desert for generations, these machines represented hope, tangible, mechanical hope that the tide could actually be turned. The American context. Why this matters across the Pacific. When news of China's desert restoration achievements began circulating in international engineering communities, the reaction from American engineers was particularly striking. Many expressed disbelief. Some openly questioned whether the reported numbers were accurate or perhaps exaggerated for propaganda purposes. This skepticism wasn't born from professional rivalry. It came from lived experience with how difficult desert reclamation truly is. The United States knows desertification intimately. Of America's 9.6 million square kilometers of land, approximately 30%, nearly 3 million square kilometers, faces serious desertification or land degradation challenges. The problem concentrates heavily in the southwestern states, creating ongoing environmental and economic pressures. But the nation's desert trauma goes back further, to an ecological catastrophe that defined a generation, the Dust Bowl. During the 1930s, a combination of severe drought and poor agricultural practices created conditions for one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. Massive dust storms, some carrying topsoil as far as the Atlantic Ocean, swept across 31 states. The storms were so severe that they darkened skies at noon, buried homes, and made breathing dangerous. Crops failed across enormous regions. Farmland became desert. Families abandoned their homes by the hundreds of thousands, creating waves of environmental refugees immortalized in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. The economic damage compounded the Great Depression's effects, and the social upheaval reshaped American demographics. The Dust Bowl became a watershed moment in American environmental consciousness. It led to the creation of the Soil Conservation Service and revolutionized thinking about land management and agricultural sustainability. Since then, the United States has invested heavily in desert control and land conservation. American engineers have deployed drought-resistant crops, sophisticated drip irrigation systems, sand barriers, and extensive tree planting programs. Research institutions have studied desert ecosystems for decades, developing strategies tailored to North American conditions. Yet despite these efforts and enormous expenditures, progress has been frustratingly slow. Extreme climate variability, increasingly severe droughts punctuated by intense rainfall, undermines restoration efforts. Young plants die before they can establish deep root systems. Sand barriers require constant maintenance. The costs mount while results remain modest. This is why China's reported success captured such intense attention. If the numbers were real, if it was actually possible to restore desert land at the speed and scale China claimed, it would represent a fundamental breakthrough. The Jumang 301 and similar systems offer something American desert management has lacked: the ability to operate at scale without being constrained by labor availability. These machines can work in conditions that would be dangerous for human teams. They don't tire. They maintain consistent quality across millions of repetitive actions. For the United States, the potential applications are enormous. The southwestern deserts, the Sonoran, Chihuahuan, and Great Basin deserts, cover vast territories. Conventional restoration approaches would require decades and billions of dollars with uncertain outcomes. Mechanized restoration technology could change that equation entirely. What if degraded rangelands could be restored at speed? What if desertifying agricultural margins could be stabilized before complete loss? What if the advancing edges of existing deserts could be pushed back rather than merely contained? These aren't just environmental questions. They're economic ones. Land degradation costs the U.S. economy billions annually through lost agricultural productivity, increased wildfire risk, water resource degradation, and other impacts. Effective restoration technology could turn a constant resource drain into recoverable assets. But adopting such technology would require more than just buying machines. It would demand rethinking entire operational frameworks, training new specialists, developing supporting infrastructure, and perhaps most challengingly, accepting that another nation might have leapfrogged ahead in a critical environmental technology. That last point creates interesting dynamics. Technology transfer, licensing arrangements, adaptation to different desert environments, and questions of strategic autonomy all come into play. These are conversations happening now in U.S. Department of Agriculture offices, environmental NGOs, and agricultural research institutions. The Global Desert Challenge. It's worth stepping back from the U.S.-China comparison to consider the bigger picture. Desertification isn't a problem confined to any single nation or region. It's a global crisis affecting every inhabited continent. The United Nations estimates that over 2 billion people worldwide live in regions affected by desertification. About 3.2 billion people, nearly half the global population, inhabit areas of degraded land. Each year, approximately 12 million hectares of productive land become desert, unable to support agriculture or sustain communities. The human toll is immense. Desertification drives food insecurity, forces migration, triggers conflicts over shrinking resources, and perpetuates poverty in vulnerable regions. When land becomes desert, entire communities lose their livelihood foundation. People face impossible choices: stay and starve, or abandon ancestral homes and become refugees. Climate change accelerates these processes. Rising temperatures, shifting precipitation patterns, and more extreme weather events all intensify desertification. Regions that were marginally arid become full deserts. Areas that were fertile become marginal. The problem feeds itself. Less vegetation means less moisture retention, which means less rainfall, which means even less vegetation. Countries worldwide have attempted various approaches to combat this crisis. Africa's Great Green Wall Initiative aims to plant an 8,000-kilometer belt of vegetation across the Sahel region from Senegal to Djibouti. Middle Eastern nations have invested in massive irrigation projects and salt-tolerant plant development. Australia has developed extensive dryland management techniques suited to its vast interior. Each approach reflects local conditions, available resources, and specific challenges. But all share a common constraint: the sheer scale of the problem versus the limited speed of traditional restoration methods. This is why China's technological approach represents more than just a national achievement. It offers a potential template that could be adapted globally. The principles behind the Jumang 301 and similar systems, mechanization, automation, real-time monitoring, integrated operations, can be applied anywhere desertification occurs. Of course, implementation wouldn't be identical everywhere. Desert types vary enormously. The Sahara's hyper-arid conditions differ fundamentally from the Gobi's cold desert environment, which differs from the Sonoran's hot desert ecosystem. Soil composition, temperature ranges, rainfall patterns, indigenous plant species, all these factors require adaptation of techniques and technology. But the core innovation, scaling up restoration through sophisticated machinery, transcends these differences. The specific machines might need modification, the selected plants might differ, and the operational protocols might vary. But the underlying approach remains sound. International cooperation on this front has been growing. Chinese companies specializing in desert restoration equipment have begun exploring partnerships in Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Technology transfer agreements are being negotiated. Training programs for international operators are being developed. Use a male transatlantic voice for the narrator. Add clean subtitles with no outline. Don't use iStock.